The land north of Redemption Creek was a hard country in the fall of 1882. It was a place of subtraction. The wind stripped the color from the grass, leaving it bleached pale as old bone. The sun baked the moisture from the earth until the clay cracked in a fine web, and the cold nights stole the warmth from a man's blood. It was a landscape that offered no comfort and told no lies. Silas Blackwood understood it. He rode a line horse, a tough, unassuming bay that moved with the same weary economy he did. He had been a man with a place, with a wife whose laugh was the only music he had ever needed, and a son whose small hand in his was a promise of a future. The fever of '79 had taken them both, and with them it had taken the man he was. What was left was a quiet, deliberate shell. A man in his late 30s who looked 10 years older, his face a map of long miles and too many sunrises seen alone. He was not running from anything. He was just moving, because to stop felt like a kind of surrender he was not yet ready to make. His past was not a ghost that haunted him. It was an anchor, and he was dragging it across the continent. He had been in motion for 3 years. He had drifted through cattle towns in Kansas and mining camps in the Rockies, taking work where he found it, speaking only when necessary. He was capable. He could mend a fence so it would stand against a blizzard. He could gentle a horse that others had given up on, and he could sit in a room full of men and be entirely invisible. It was a skill he had cultivated. He asked for nothing and expected less. Redemption Creek was not a destination. It was just a place on the way to nowhere else. A handful of clapboard buildings huddled against a low rise, braced against the ceaseless wind. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church whose steeple seemed to be pleading with a vacant sky. As he rode down the single dusty street, he felt the town's eyes on him. They were the familiar eyes of small, closed places, suspicious, weary, and hungry for any distraction from their own quiet desperation. He saw her then. She was coming out of the mercantile, a burlap sack clutched in one hand. She was tall for a woman, with a straightness to her back that seemed defiant. Her hair was the color of wheat, pulled back severely, and her face was plain but composed, her expression unreadable. The town's attention, which had briefly settled on Silas, shifted to her with a palpable weight. A group of women standing by the church turned their backs in a single, practiced motion. The storekeeper, a portly man with a sour face, stepped out onto his porch and spat into the dust near her feet. The gesture was small, but it was as loud as a gunshot in the quiet street. The woman did not flinch. She did not hurry her pace. She simply walked on, her gaze fixed ahead, her worn boots stirring little puffs of red dust. She was an island, and the rest of the town was a hostile sea. Silas watched her go. He had seen cruelty before, had seen men beaten and shunned. But there was a particular kind of meanness reserved for women who broke some unspoken rule. He did not know her story, and he did not want to. Getting involved was a currency he no longer possessed. He reined his horse toward the livery, his own business, the only thing that mattered. A bed for the night, grain for his horse, then he would move on. But the image of her straight back and the deliberate, silent contempt of the town stayed with him. It was a stone dropped into the still, quiet pool of his own solitude. He left his horse with the liveryman, a taciturn old man who took his coin without a word. Silas walked to the mercantile, the same one the woman had just left. The sour-faced man, whose name was Barlow, watched him enter, his eyes assessing the worn coat, the re-soled boots, the lean capability of the stranger. "Passing through?" Barlow asked. His voice was thick with the self-importance of a man who owned the only store for 50 miles. "For now," Silas said. He moved through the cramped aisles, gathering what he needed: flour, coffee, beans, a small tin of lard. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his hands steady. He was aware of the other men in the store, 2 ranchers leaning against the counter, their talk dropping to a murmur as they watched him. He placed his goods on the counter. Barlow tallied the cost, his fingers slow and deliberate. "That woman," one of the ranchers said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Elara, still showing her face. Got the devil's own pride," the other agreed. "After what she did. Ought to have run her out long ago." Barlow grunted in agreement, his eyes flickering toward Silas, gauging his reaction. Silas offered none. He stared at the sack of flour, his face a mask of indifference. He had learned that the easiest way to navigate the world was to pretend you were deaf to its ugliness. "She's got that plot of land her folks left her," Barlow said, a sneer in his voice. 3 miles north. Useless piece of ground. She can't work it. Can't sell it. No decent man will have her. She'll starve out there come winter. Silas counted out the coins onto the worn wood of the counter. His movements were precise. He did not look at the men. He did not want to see the smugness in their faces. He felt a familiar weariness settle over him. The world was full of Barlows, men who drew their strength from the weakness of others. He picked up his supplies. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught a detail Barlow and his cronies had missed. By the door, a heavy barrel of salted fish sat precariously balanced on 3 loose stones. The woman in her passage must have brushed against it. It was now tilted at a dangerous angle, ready to spill its contents across the floor. It was the kind of small, impending disaster that spoke of carelessness and neglect. Without a word, Silas set down his sack. He knelt, his knees cracking softly. He studied the problem for a moment, then calmly took a wooden shim from a nearby stack of kindling and worked it into the gap, leveraging the barrel back until it was stable. He tested it with his hand. It was solid now. He stood, picked up his sack, and walked out. He had not done it for them. He had done it because a thing was not right, and he knew how to fix it. It was as simple as that. But as he stepped back into the harsh sunlight, he knew it was not simple at all. He had acted. In this town that judged and condemned, he had chosen to mend something broken. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. A deviation from the path of non-involvement he had walked for so long. He found a room for the night above the saloon. It was small and smelled of stale beer and regret, but it had a bed. He sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress and thought about the woman, Elara. He thought about her straight back and the quiet dignity with which she had absorbed the town's scorn. He thought about the failing piece of land, a place she could neither work nor leave. He was a man who knew about being trapped. The next morning he rode north. He told himself he was just scouting, seeing the lay of the land before he moved on. The excuse felt thin even to him. The road was little more than a pair of ruts in the dry earth. After 3 miles he saw it. A small unpainted cabin and a leaning barn, surrounded by a field of stones and stubborn weeds. The fence was a ruin, its posts rotted, its wire lying coiled and useless in the dust. It was a picture of defeat. She was by the well, wrestling with the hand pump. The handle was stuck, and she was putting all her weight into it, her knuckles white. She was failing. Silas dismounted and tied his horse to a solid fence post, one of the few still standing. He walked toward her, his steps slow and deliberate so as not to startle her. She heard him anyway. She stopped struggling with the pump and turned, her body tensing. She held a heavy wrench in her other hand, and she did not put it down. Her eyes met his. They were a clear, pale gray, the color of the sky before a storm. They were taking stock eyes. They measured him, assessing his height, his worn clothes, the calluses on his hands. There was no fear in them, only a deep, bottomless caution. "The pump," Silas said, his voice raspy from disuse. He gestured toward it. Look seized. She did not answer immediately. She watched him, her silence a wall. "I can manage it," she said finally. Her voice was low and steady, without a trace of the victim in it. "You can," he agreed. "But it would be faster with 2. He did not wait for permission. He walked to the well, took the handle, and examined the mechanism. Rust and grit had worked their way into the joint. He looked back at her. She had not moved. The wrench was still in her hand. "I saw you in town yesterday," he said. It was not an accusation or an offer of pity. It was just a statement of fact. Her chin lifted a fraction of an inch. Most people do. He ignored the challenge in her tone. "I'm looking for work, a few days' worth. I'm good with my hands. I can fix that pump. I can fix that fence, in exchange for meals and a place to sleep in your barn." He laid the offer out plainly, a simple transaction. He expected her to refuse. He expected the same suspicion the town had shown him. He expected her to see him as another threat, another man come to take something from her. She studied him for a long moment. Her gray eyes moved from his face to his hands, then to the steady way he stood, balanced and quiet, asking for nothing more than what he had stated. "Why?" she asked. It was a simple question, but it held the weight of her entire world. Why would a stranger offer to help the town pariah? Silas thought of his wife, of his son, of the years he had spent simply moving. He thought of the smug faces of the men in the store and the quiet injustice of it all. He did not have an easy answer. "Because the pump is broken," he said, "and the fence is down, and I know how to fix them." It was the truest thing he could say. She seemed to consider this, turning his words over as if testing their weight. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "The barn is dry. There's hay in the loft. It was not an invitation to friendship. It was an acceptance of a business proposal. That was all, and that suited Silas just fine. He set to work. He spent the rest of the day on the pump, carefully dismantling it, cleaning the rust from the gears, greasing the joints until the handle moved with a smooth, satisfying rhythm. She worked nearby, weeding the stubborn patch of garden that produced what little food she had. They did not speak. The only sounds were the scrape of his tools and the soft thud of her hoe against the hard-packed earth. He watched her as he worked. She moved with a purpose that he recognized. It was the efficiency of someone who knew that wasted motion was a luxury she could not afford. She was not beaten, not lazy, just worn down by a fight she had been waging alone for too long. That evening, she left a plate of beans and cornbread on a crate near the barn door. When he had finished, he washed the plate and fork in the horse trough and left them on the same crate. It was a silent, practical communication. The next day, he started on the fence. It was a bigger job, miles of wire to be untangled and stretched, dozens of new posts to be cut and set. As he worked under the relentless sun, she led her horse out of the barn. It was a rangy sorrel as lean and tough as she was. She saddled it with practiced ease. Silas paused in his work, leaning on a post-hole digger. He watched her check the cinch, her movements sure and economical. He had been wondering about her story. He still did not want to know the details of her trouble with the town. But he needed to know something more fundamental. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty glove. "Can you ride?" he asked. The question was abrupt, practical. In this country, it was as essential as asking if a person could breathe. But it was more than that. He was asking if she was capable, if she was a survivor. She finished with the saddle and turned to face him fully. Her gray eyes held his, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something beyond mere caution. It might have been anger, or it might have been pride. "I can ride," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet air, each word a carefully placed stone. "I can also shoot, plow a straight furrow, and set a broken bone. The question is, can you?" The words stopped him cold. He had expected a simple yes. He had expected defensiveness, or perhaps a question about why he was asking. He had not expected a challenge. He had not expected to be measured and found wanting. She was not just answering his question. She was defining the terms of their engagement. She was his equal. A slow smile touched the corner of Silas's mouth. It was a rusty, unfamiliar expression. He had not truly smiled in 3 years. "I can," he said, his voice quiet. "And I can fix a fence." She gave a single sharp nod, as if he had finally passed some crucial test. She swung into the saddle with a fluid grace that belied her worn clothes and weary expression. She did not say where she was going. She simply turned the sorrel and rode out, her back as straight and unyielding as it had been in town. Silas watched her until she was a small speck against the vast, empty landscape. He felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the anchor he had been dragging for so long. He had come to this place looking for nothing, a ghost passing through, but he had found a woman who refused to be a ghost in her own life. He turned back to the fence line, picking up the heavy digger. The earth was hard and unforgiving. The work was brutal. But for the first time in a very long time, it felt like he was building something instead of just leaving something behind. They fell into a rhythm. Days were for work. Nights were for the quiet that settled over the high plains. Silas toiled on the fence line, his hands raw at the knuckles, his muscles aching with a satisfying burn. He worked from sunup to sundown, his focus absolute. He was a man who understood the logic of a straight fence. It was an honest thing. It declared what was yours and what was not. It was a line drawn against the chaos of the world. Alara worked just as hard. She tended her garden, mended the barn roof, and spent hours preserving the meager harvest she had managed to coax from the dry soil. She moved with a quiet competence that he deeply respected. Competence, in his experience, was a rarer and more valuable thing than goodness. They rarely spoke more than a few words at a time. "Coffee's on," she would say in the morning, leaving a tin mug for him on the porch rail. "Need more water," he would state, and she would bring the bucket to the fence line without another word. Their communication was a language of shared tasks and understood needs. It was a partnership forged in the practicalities of survival. He learned about her in small pieces, not from what she said, but from what she did. He saw the way she carefully saved seeds from her best vegetables, a quiet act of faith in a future she had no reason to believe in. He noticed the worn book by her bedside, its spine broken from countless readings. He saw the way she treated her horse, with a gentle hand and a soft voice that she never used with people. These small details painted a picture of a woman of deep reserves, of a quiet intelligence and an unbreachable integrity. One evening, a week into his stay, a cold snap descended from the mountains. The wind howled around the small cabin, rattling the window frames. Silas had been sleeping in the hayloft, but the cold was a bitter, searching thing. He was mending a piece of tack by the light of a lantern when she appeared at the barn door. "You'll freeze out here," she said. It was not a suggestion. It was a fact. "There's a fire inside. You can take the floor by the hearth." He looked up at her, surprised. It was the first time she had invited him into her home. He nodded, gathered his bedroll, and followed her. The cabin was a single room, but it was clean and orderly. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting a warm, flickering light on the plain wooden furniture. It was the first real warmth he had felt in years, a warmth that went deeper than the skin. He laid his bedroll by the fire. She sat in a rocking chair on the other side of the hearth, a mending basket in her lap. The silence between them was different in here. It was thicker, more intimate. The howling wind outside seemed to amplify the quiet within. "My wife, Sarah," Silas said, his voice low. He did not know why he was speaking. The words just came. "She loved a fire. She said it was the heart of a home." Alara stopped her mending. She looked at him, her gray eyes softened by the firelight. She did not offer empty words of sympathy. She just listened. "We had a boy, Samuel. He had his mother's eyes." He paused, the memories sharp and clear. "It was the fever. Took them both in the same week. I buried them on a Tuesday. We had a small place back in Ohio. Good soil, I couldn't stay." The silence was too loud. He felt quiet, having said more than he had said to anyone in 3 years. He felt exposed, raw. Alara set her mending aside. "My parents built this cabin," she said, her voice soft. "They came from the east with nothing but 2 mules and a belief in hard work. They loved this land, even when it gave them nothing back. They died 2 winters ago. Lung fever." She looked into the fire, her face a study in quiet grief. They were good people, honest. They believed in the goodness of others, too. That was their mistake. The story came out then, not in a rush, but in spare, unadorned sentences. She told him about Thomas Barlow, the storekeeper's son. He had courted her, and her parents had approved. He was from the most powerful family in the county. But she had seen a cruelty in him, a way he had with animals and with people he considered beneath him. She had refused his proposal of marriage. Thomas, his pride wounded, had retaliated. He and his father spread a vicious lie, a story about her character so vile that the town, eager for a villain and deferential to the Barlow's power, had accepted it as truth. She became an outcast. Friends stopped speaking to her. The church shunned her. Her parents had died before the worst of it, but she was left to bear the weight of the town's judgment alone. "They think shame is a disease you can catch," she said, her voice devoid of self-pity. "So they keep their distance." Silas listened, his hands clenched into fists. He understood the casual cruelty of the world, the way a lie could take on a life of its own. He looked at this woman, at her strength and her solitude, and felt a cold, protective anger rise in him. "A lie is a heavy thing to carry," he said. "Truth is heavier," she replied, "when no one else is willing to help you lift it." They sat in silence for a long time after that, the fire crackling between them. It was a turning point. They were no longer just an employer and a hired hand. They were 2 people who had shared the geography of their loss. A bond had been forged in that quiet, firelit room, stronger than any fence he could build. The fence was finished 2 weeks later. It was a good fence, with sturdy posts and wire stretched tight and true. It ran the entire perimeter of her property. It was a declaration, it said. "This place is cared for. This place has a defender." Silas knew he should leave. The job was done. But the thought of moving on, of returning to the empty road, felt wrong. It felt like leaving a part of himself behind. He had started to put down roots in this hard, unforgiving soil, and the thought terrified him. He was chopping wood by the barn when he saw the buggy approaching. It was a fancy one, pulled by a matched pair of blacks. Silas recognized the man holding the reins. It was Barlow, the storekeeper, the man who had spat in the dust at Alara's feet. Silas set the axe down and stood straight. He did not move toward the buggy, nor did he retreat. He simply waited, a quiet, immovable object. Barlow pulled the buggy to a halt and looked down at Silas, his face a mask of contempt. "You're the drifter she hired." "I'm the man who fixed the fence," Silas corrected him. Alara came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on an apron. She stood on the porch, her face calm, but Silas could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. "Barlow," she said. Her voice was level. "You are not welcome here." Barlow laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "This isn't a social call, Elara. You're 3 months behind on the note for this property. The note my father held, and which I now hold, I've come to collect, or to foreclose." He held up a piece of paper. The legal authority was a weapon, and he wielded it with relish. "I've had a bad harvest," she said. "You know that. I need more time." "Time is something I'm fresh out of," Barlow sneered. "And frankly, the town would be better off without your kind living so close. It's a moral stain on the community." He looked from her to Silas, his eyes filled with insinuation. "Seems you found a new way to pay your debts." The insult hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Silas saw the color drain from Alara's face. He took a step forward, placed himself between her and the buggy. He was not a big man, but there was a stillness about him, a coiled intensity that made Barlow shift uncomfortably in his seat. "The debt," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "How much is it?" Barlow looked surprised. "What's it to you, Drifter? How much?" $150, Barlow said, a smug look returning to his face. "More than you've seen in a year, I'd wager." Silas did not react. He stood for a moment, the calculations turning in his mind. He had $200 saved, sewn into the lining of his coat. It was every cent he had in the world. It was the money that kept him moving, the money that kept him free from attachments. It was his anchor, but it was also his shield. He thought of the road ahead, of the lonely nights and the meaningless work. He thought of the silence that had been his only companion for 3 years. Then he looked back at the cabin, at the sturdy fence, at the woman standing on the porch, her quiet dignity a beacon in a cruel world. He knew what he had to do. The moral calculus was simple. Some things were worth more than money. Some things were worth everything. "You'll have your money by sundown," Silas said. Barlow stared, incredulous. "You?" "By sundown," Silas repeated. He turned his back on the man, a clear dismissal, and walked toward the barn. The confrontation was over. He had drawn his line not with a gun, but with a promise. He heard the buggy turn and retreat down the road. He did not look back. Elara came down from the porch. She stood before him, her gray eyes searching his face. "You don't have that kind of money," she said. It was not a question. "I do," he said. "You can't," she whispered. "That's everything you have. I can't let you do that." "It's my choice," he said. He looked at her, and for the first time, he let her see past the wall he kept around himself. He let her see the years of loneliness, the weariness, the deep, aching need to find a place to stop. "I'm tired of running, Elara. I'm tired of fixing things that don't matter." He went into the barn, retrieved the money from his coat, and rode into town. The ride was quiet, the landscape indifferent. But Silas felt a lightness he had not known was possible. He was no longer drifting. He was moving toward something. He walked into the mercantile. The ranchers were there again, along with a few other townsmen. They all stopped talking when he entered. Barlow stood behind the counter, a look of smug disbelief on his face. Silas walked to the counter and counted out $150 in worn bills and gold coin. The sound of the money on the wood was the only sound in the room. "The note for Alara's property," Silas said, "and a receipt saying it's paid in full." Barlow stared at the money, his jaw slack. He had never expected this. He had used shame and power as his weapons, and they had failed against simple, quiet integrity. Slowly, resentfully, he wrote out the receipt and handed over the deed. Silas took the papers, folded them carefully, and placed them inside his shirt. He turned to the silent men watching him. "You've all judged a good woman on the word of a liar," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "You should be ashamed, not her." He turned and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. He had not raised his voice. He had not made a threat. He had simply spoken the truth, and in the small, closed world of Redemption Creek, it was as powerful as a lightning strike. He rode back to the farm as the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The land no longer looked empty to him. It looked full of promise. He found Elara on the porch, waiting. She stood as he dismounted. He walked up the steps and handed her the papers. "It's yours," he said, free and clear. She took the deed, her fingers tracing the words. He saw a single tear trace a path through the dust on her cheek. She did not weep. She just stood there, holding the proof of her freedom in her hands. "Why?" she asked again, her voice thick with emotion. The same question as before, but this time it held a different meaning. It was not a question of motive but of the heart. Silas looked out at the land, at the new fence that caught the last light of the day. He looked at the cabin, a small point of warmth and light in the growing dark. He had found it, the place he was supposed to stop, the person he was supposed to stand for. This land needs two people to make it work, he said, his voice steady. He turned to face her, meeting her clear gray eyes. I've been thinking I'd like to be the other one. He let the words hang in the air. It was a proposal, but it was also a statement of fact, as practical and honest as everything else between them. As a partner, he said, wanting to be clear, or as a husband. Either way, I'm not leaving. Alara looked at him, truly looked at him. She saw the quiet strength, the deep well of kindness he tried so hard to hide. She saw a man who had met her on her own terms, who had judged her by her actions, not by the whispers of others. She saw a man who had seen her. A slow smile spread across her face, a real smile that lit up her eyes and transformed her plain features into something beautiful. Yes, she said. The word was simple, but it held everything. I would want that. 2 years passed. The wind still scoured the high plains, and the winters were still long and hard. But the farm was no longer a place of defeat. It was a place of life. The leaning barn had been replaced by a sturdy new one, built with timber Silas had hauled down from the mountains. The field of stones was now a field of wheat, its golden heads nodding in the breeze. The garden was twice as large, its bounty lining the shelves of the cabin's new pantry. The town of Redemption Creek had changed too, or perhaps it had just been forced to see the truth. Barlow's influence had waned after his public defeat. A few of the townsfolk, led by an honest neighbor who had seen the injustice of it all, had started to make quiet overtures of friendship. A sack of seed left on the porch, an offer to help with the harvest. Acceptance came slowly, but it came. Silas and Alara were married by a traveling preacher in the spring of the first year. It was a quiet ceremony, held on their own front porch, with the land as their witness. Their partnership, which had begun with work and mutual respect, had deepened into a quiet, steady love. It was not a love of grand passions or flowery words. It was a love built on shared sunrises, on the comfort of a silent presence at the end of a long day, on the knowledge that they were two parts of a stronger whole. In the fall of the second year, a son was born. They named him Samuel. He had his mother's clear, gray eyes and a laugh that filled the quiet corners of the cabin, chasing away the last of the shadows from his father's past. One evening, as the last light faded, Silas stood on the porch, the baby sleeping soundly in his arms. Alara came to stand beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. They looked out at their land, at the straight, true fences, at the fields resting under a blanket of stars. The air was crisp and cold, but here together they were warm. He was no longer the man who had drifted into town. The motion had stopped. The anchor was gone, replaced by roots that ran deep into the hard soil. He had not found a home. He had built one post by post, word by word, promise by promise. He looked down at his wife, at the quiet strength in her face, and felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. She had answered his simple question, "Can you ride?" with a challenge that had changed his life. She had asked him if he could stand, and in standing for her, he had found a way to stand for himself again. The greatest things in this world are not found, but forged. A home is not a place you stumble upon in your wanderings. It is a structure you build with your own two hands, in partnership with another. It is built of honesty and shared labor, of quiet understanding and the courage to defend what is right. For a man lost in the wilderness of his own grief, the hardest thing is not to keep moving, but to find a reason to stop. It is to find a piece of ground and a person worth drawing a line around and calling your own. It is to learn that the deepest peace comes not from escaping the past, but from building a future worthy of its memory.